in this final part, we're going to talk a little bit of what I think is a contradiction. Because throughout the paper, and again, this may be just my bias, this may be just how I'm reading it and interpreting it, but it seems like through the study there is a sort of a bias against using the neutral posture, because people, even when they lift, they come out of it, so therefore it doesn't matter. Although in part 2, when we talked about it, they did come to say that when you come out of neutral spine, you put more stress on the passive structures, and that can lead to tissue damage. Now, what they say at the end of the study, which is allowing some lumbar flexion to occur during lifting exercises, may therefore reduce stress on the passive structures at the hip and provide the athlete with a movement strategy that preserves the health of the hip joint. So what I think they're describing, now I need to sort of put that as a caveat to it, is this is how I'm interpreting it, is that when people flex their spine and they don't need to flex their hip as much, they are reducing the stress on the passive structures of the hip. But what we've already talked about is that if you come out of neutral, you put more pressure on the passive structures of the spine. So what we're dealing with now is checks and balances. So they're saying that if we come out of neutral, we'll put more pressure on the spine, but we'll save the hip. Whereas I'm saying, if we maintain neutral, we'll minimise pressure on the spine, but we'll put a bit more pressure on the hip. Now, for me personally, I would be more inclined to put more pressure on the hip, for the very simple reason that that is what the hip is designed for. Because way back, I guess it would be the 1500s, when Da Vinci was dissecting the body, I have his book back there. So it's basically a book. So if you've ever seen The Mechanics of Man by Leonardo da Vinci, he drew out human anatomy. He dissected bodies and he drew everything. And he's got notes, and these notes have been translated. And in that book, he says something along the lines of the greatest and most powerful muscle in the body is the buttocks, as when man is lifting. So he knew back then that those muscles were for lifting. We know now with science that we need to lift using the hips. They are strong, powerful muscles. The hip joint is a freely movable synovial joint. It is able to go through large ranges of movement. The muscles around it are strong and powerful. So we've got a joint that can go through large ranges of movement, and we've got muscles around it that can tolerate load, heavy load. Whereas when we look at the spine, it's different. It's a cartilaginous joint, or there are cartilaginous joints within the spine that will dictate its limited movement. So it's limited in movement. Its muscles aren't as strong and powerful as the glutes. So to me, it would be more advantageous to maintain the posture of the spine and focus on getting more force through the hip, for the very simple reason it can deal with it. Now again, as I've described all the way through this, that will depend on the individual's capacity to do it, because the hip is exactly the same as the spine, in that it needs to build tolerance, build capacity, so you're able to do the lifting. But what it sounds like is it's one rule for the hip and another rule for the spine. It's like you can bend your spine, but don't flex your hip. That's the kind of thing that, or they're not saying you shouldn't flex your hip, they're saying you have the potential. So if you flex your spine a bit, you will save your hip a bit. So again, I would be more inclined to do it the other way around. Maintain the posture of the spine as best you can. If you need to elevate a weight from the floor, then by all means do it. but focus on using the hips and getting the load through them and building them, because they are able to do it better. So with regards to the hip and the spine, or the maintaining of neutral spine, I should say, again, there's still nothing. And apparently, I was going to be converted from this study, because he was very sure that I should read it. There were 126 references, so it must be a good study. But again, as I read it, there's still nothing in there that's terribly convincing that is changing my mind about how we use a neutral spine, how we lift, and things like that. It's not that there's not good information in them. There's good information in there. It just seems to be slanted in a certain direction when they talk about as we've described it, when they talk about maintaining a neutral spine. Well, we'd rather not flex the hip quite as much. I'd rather you bend the spine a bit than flex the hip as much, which again doesn't really sit with the consistency that seems to go through how to lift properly. So again, I could sort of go round in circles with this information, but I think it's wise to end there. So if you found this useful, please do hit the like button. If you've got something to say about anything that's been said in this podcast, if you agree, if you disagree, stick it in the comment section below. If you've learnt something new, hit the thanks button. And if you want to watch more like this, please do hit the subscribe button and the bell icon, and you'll be notified. Many thanks for watching. Speak to you soon.